You're listening to the Color Country Podcast, your passport to the breathtaking public lands and tourism destinations nestled in southern Utah and northern Arizona. Join host Stephanie DeGraw and her guests.
Hi, and welcome to the Color Country Podcast. Today, I'm talking with David Dodds from Garfield County. David, go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know what position you hold over there.
Yeah, I'm David Dodds. I'm the Public Works Director for Garfield County. In addition to my Public Works role, I do public lands coordination as well.
Great, and you're the perfect person to talk to. We're going to be talking about Garfield County's concerns about the resource management plan for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And as you guys see it, as what I understand, there's been a lack of public input. And we want to talk about the importance of local knowledge in managing public lands and some of your concerns. Let's jump in and get an overview of your concerns about the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument.
Yeah, so we have a lot of concerns, and so this might take a bit of time, but we kind of have a list that we've prepared in presentations we've given to the public. The first concern we have is the objects aren't identified in the plan itself. The BLM keeps referring to the proclamation, but the proclamation is actually pretty vague. It talks about multi-hued cliffs, slot canyons, pools of numbingly cold water. It's pretty vague. There are a few specific things. There's this paleontological things that they talk about, and we as a county, we understand that there are actually objects out there that should be identified that deserve protection. Our issue is they haven't specified that. They haven't specified where those are, because while we do want to protect those objects, we need to understand where they're at so that we can help mitigate whatever issues they are having. At the same time, we want to be able to have multiple use around those objects. We don't want to just lock up the whole entire monument, under this vague sense of, there's objects out there, don't disturb them. Area is huge. It's 1.8 million acres. It's a significant portion of our county. It's a significant portion of our economy. And so we want to understand, where they are, what they are, so we can help protect those. The law that they use for the protection of the objects and for the monument itself is actually the Antiquities Act, which does give the president, authority to designate these areas. Specifically, within the Antiquities Act, it says that it should be confined. It says in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. And that's one of our big arguments is, yeah, we understand there's objects out there, but 1.8 million acres isn't necessary to protect those objects. Moving on in this list, there's reduction in grazing. Obviously, that's a concern for our economy. Limitations on range improvements. So even in the areas where they want us to graze, they're limiting on how we can do range improvements, which actually makes it more difficult to successfully graze and do it in a manner that doesn't impact objects.
What would be an improvement that you guys would try and do for the?
So there's several, and they're pretty well established and pretty well known. One of those would be fencing. Anytime somebody wants to fence something to keep cattle in an area or out of an area, they have to do an environmental assessment, which can take a long time.
Oh.
And they're wanting to limit those. They are also, where that can happen. Same thing with water improvements. A big thing out in the desert, obviously, is water. And one of the issues you see with water is that cattle they gather around water improvements. Yes. And that creates some resource damages because the cattle are just sticking to one area. We would like to do additional water improvements, spread them out on the range, have them graze more efficiently between locations so they're not just in one location and overutilizing one specific area. We want to spread them out. Those are in addition, we'd like to do seedings. Sometimes the vegetation isn't appropriate for the cattle there. It might be just in need of improvement. They've done old rangeland seedings that they're out of date. They need new vegetation types, drought-resisting vegetations. These are all things we can do to help grazing, and in addition to helping grazing, it does benefit wildlife as well. Wildlife can use those. One thing we've seen is there's a lot of pinyon and juniper, and it's kind of expanding beyond its native range. And if you're familiar with pinyon and juniper, it actually shades out the rest of the vegetation. We've had a lot of successful treatments around the Panguish area where they've taken the pinyon and juniper out. When we talk about grazing, we talk about pounds of forage per acre, and we've gone from anywhere from 50 pounds of forage per acre up to, before these treatments, up to between 500 and 1,000. So you can imagine how much better that is for both cattle and wildlife that utilize that area. So those are things that in this specific plan, they are limiting how we can do that, when we can do that, where we can do that, to the point where it's very difficult to do those improvements if we want to.
Well, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that there were those kind of improvements, and I'm happy you're on my podcast today so we can understand that there are ways to work together and improve the land and make it more productive, and yet, like you said, help the impact on wildlife as well. Let's talk about maybe some of the transportation issues that the plan is proposing. I think they're talking about limiting some vehicle access and why that could be a problem for your county.
Yeah, this is one of our biggest issues. The way they're doing this is there's kind of two different transportation planning efforts. So the initial transportation planning that goes on during the resource management plan is that they select areas where they say, you know what, we don't want any transportation here at all. They create zones of these closed areas. And, historically, it's been a few thousand acres in very key areas where we all know and understand that vehicles probably shouldn't be there. So originally, in the original proclamation and the original designation, there was only 2,500 acres where they closed an area to vehicles. That was in No Man's Mesa. And we all understood, well, there's no roads up there anyway, for one. And two, we understand, that's a place where they have some research going on. We don't want vehicles up there. That's very reasonable. We are very supportive of that. The problem we're seeing, and this isn't typical, is that in this plan, they are proposing under Alternative B, I think somewhere around 800,000 or 900,000 acres. Same with Alternative C, where they're closing 800,000 or 900,000 acres, and then under Alternative D, it's got to be 1.6 million acres that they are closing vehicles, up to half to probably 7/8 of the monument, depending on the alternatives we're looking at, that they are closing these areas to vehicles in this resource management plan.
Are they saying that's to protect the areas, or are they being vague? What are you
It's very
seeing?
vague. Part of it is the wilderness study area, which we understand. Okay, you don't want vehicles. There's certain areas where within that you can, certain areas you can't. And then under the Alternative B, we asked them, we said, what is this? Where did this come from? And they said, well, we did some modeling based on potential for archaeological sites and paleontological sites, and this is what we came up with. That's a huge area, though. Have you ground truth this? No. Okay. So it's kind of vague.
So it's an estimation, perhaps, on their part. Okay, and you'd probably like more specifics before having it completely closed off, it sounds like.
Yeah, and so this creates a lot of confusion. Usually in these plans, like I said, they designate very small areas where we all know and understand a vehicle shouldn't go. And then after that, we go and assess all of the routes on the monument. We do a huge inventory, and then we talk about them one by one and decide, okay, is this an appropriate route to keep open, or should we close it? So when they have these areas as open, that doesn't mean it's open to all travel. They actually call it limited. And so everywhere in the monument actually is limited to designated routes, and we do a separate plan to identify what routes are existing and to designate them as an open route or a closed route. And that's where we feel like they're kind of skipping that whole thing by designating huge swaths of area to be closed. In an analysis we've done, we're estimating in alternative C, their preferred alternative, there are 520 miles of existing routes, whether they're designated or undesignated, doesn't matter. People are using them today, would effectively become closed under this plan without any analysis beyond what they're putting on a map. All we're asking for is to say, let's do the actual travel management plan. Let's do an inventory of all the routes, and let's do it one by one and decide whether or not that route is valuable, if it's impacting a cultural site. Let's look at it like you normally do. Like I said, this is unprecedented.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact on livestock producers. We've talked about managing the range better. How is this proposal going to impact livestock producers?
Let me just pull up my maps here just to give me a better reminder of what they're doing. Within the monument, there are several livestock allotments. I think there's around 50 or 60 separate livestock allotments, and these allotment owners, they have bought these allotments, they paid for them, they pay an annual fee along with those, where they can graze their livestock. And each one of these allotments has a certain amount of cattle that they can handle. And they all have a grazing plan associated with them, telling the producers, here's what you can do, here's how many cattle you can graze, and this is the season of use. So with that background, what we're seeing is that under each of the alternatives, Alternative A is status quo. You guys can continue to graze like you have been. Alternative B, they're just closing a handful of allotments. From our understanding, these are allotments that were kind of closed under the Trump plan, we call it. It was the 2020 plan during the Trump administration, and they're just kind of reconfirming that. And then Alternative C, they're moving on to close allotments within the NRA, which the BLM actually manages some of the grazing allotments within the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. And we have a big problem with that because we feel like they don't have a jurisdiction to analyze those allotments. We feel like that's an NRA thing. And from my understanding, that's since been discussed, and the NRA has actually repealed that. So Alternative C may not impact them very much at all. Alternative D is where we get into, they are closing about 50% of the allotments on the monument. And a real big issue we have with this is that they are doing it without any analysis. The most recent analysis that they have is from 2006. Yeah, it's very concerning. We support improving grazing. We want to do it right. We don't want to impact any objects. We don't want to destroy our natural resources. And the producers actually have an investment in this. They don't want to overgraze because that means eventually they're going to be out of business, right? So what we're asking is, okay, maybe, there's changes that could happen with grazing, but you need to do your homework first. You cannot use data from 20 years ago to justify changes in grazing. One of the big things about this monument is they call it a science monument. Well, let's do the science. Garfield County and Kane County, we actually hired a consultant to review the BLM's current data, and they came back and said, yeah, this is completely inadequate. There's multiple errors in this data. It's obviously too old to use. Some of your sites have been misidentified. There was a whole slew of issues with it. We have a 200-page document from third party that basically tells us that this data is inadequate. We were asking the BLM, if you want to do changes, that's fine. Let's do it separate from this RMP. Let's start a new plan, a grazing plan specific, and let's do the homework first. We're okay with improving things, but you have to have justification, and the BLM just doesn't have it.
I see. And I think it's really interesting because sometimes the public gets the impression that the area doesn't want any change, but what I'm hearing you're saying is you guys are not opposed to change, but you want to make sure the research is current so that the future decisions which are really affecting your whole economy, can be done well. Is that right?
That's correct. Like I said, our economy's tied to this. The individuals producers have a major interest in keeping their operation going, and they can't do that with unsustainable practices. So yeah, if they're doing things that are unsustainable, we want to know about it. But so far, we haven't heard that. Honestly, from the 2006 data, they've actually shown that these producers have followed basically what they've told them in 2006. They followed those recommendations. So we're not seeing any reason to just eliminate grazing from these, like I said, 50% of the monument without any justification.
So if the proposal was left how it is now as far as grazing goes, did I understand correctly? You guys would be willing to then at a later point in time get with them and try and hammer out a more current grazing agreement or something like that, so that all the factors could be taken into account, how to protect your local economy, and then also protecting, and like you've explained to us, ways you could improve the landscape.
Yeah, exactly. What we've asked for, and we just haven't gotten any response to it.
I know in talking with BLM, they really care about these issues, and these are complicated issues, and there's a lot of history there. Let's move on to talking about a couple other things that in the plan would be a little bit restrictive if certain parts, alternatives were passed. And it's important for people to understand that there are different alternatives. Let's talk about your wood gathering restrictions and why is wood gathering important to your area? As I understand it, in the past, people have been able to go out and get wood. And as a city person, why is getting wood so important to you guys?
Especially the communities that are near the Grand Staircase, they don't have access to natural gas. Panguitch, where I live in the county, we do have that access, we have that advantage. But in these other areas, Canaville, Tropic, Escalante, Henryville, Boulder, they don't have natural gas, which is currently the most efficient way to heat your home, the cheapest way. And so they rely on wood gathering to supplement their home heating. And that's not only that, it's kind of a cultural thing. This is something that people around here have been doing for hundreds of years, and that's a thing that they like to heat their homes with. But yeah, it does have an impact on their actual pocketbook. The other thing I want to note is that these communities are actually what the BLM designates as an environmental justice community. So they are kind of below the average poverty line for Utah. And so in restricting the wood gathering, we're actually impacting them more. And that's one thing we've asked the BLM, hey, you haven't done any analysis, and they're required to by law, mitigate any impacts they're going to have to environmental justice communities to minimize the impact they're going to have. And they haven't really done that. And under Alternative A, which is status quo, it's what we're doing today, about half the monument's limited to wood gathering because of those wilderness study areas. And that's okay. But as you go down through the alternatives, it becomes more and more restrictive. In their preferred alternative, I'd say 95% is restricted. You cannot get wood from 95% of the monument, 1.8 million acres. And then Alternative D, they're completely restricting it. And again, I don't feel like a proper analysis is done as to why. Why are we, what data do you have to justify these limitations? Is there impacts? I understand there can be, but with only about 1,000 people gathering wood, are the impacts significant? And these people are spread out through different communities. So it seems almost malicious to me, the limitations. Under Alternative B, there's no wood gathering at all. Why is that? We're just not given any reason to that. So it is frustrating. That's something else we'd like to see is, please don't impact our communities without good justification. And that goes back to tell us where the objects are. What objects are we harming in gathering wood?
For those people that are not familiar with the area, would you say that there's plenty of wood? I mean, they're not going to run out of wood, or is it limited? I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around balancing. It sounds like alternative A could, where the status quo could still be okay from what you're saying. Maybe are they worried that we're going to run out of wood out there?
It would be very difficult in my mind. Like I said, it's not a huge community over here. It's several small towns spread out across the monument. I haven't seen any impacts from wood gathering. I think these people could go out and gather wood every day of their lives, and you still wouldn't notice it. The monument is that vast, and it's pretty densely, in a lot of areas, it has quite a bit of pinyon and juniper.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, that helps me understand that. Thank you. And it was interesting. This last weekend, I was fortunate enough to go on a mule ride down to the bottom of Bryce Canyon, for example. And in talking with one of the cowboys, he said that on the off season, he has a side business where he sells the wood that he's gathered. And so that made me think of you guys and how not only perhaps people over in your area are gathering wood for their own personal use, but I guess they could sell the firewood if they wanted to.
And that kind of falls under commercial harvest, which is even more limited under all alternatives except for alternative A. There is no commercial wood harvesting. And again, these are small scale commercial. They're just selling them as posts for fences, and you wouldn't notice if.
What are any other concerns that we haven't talked about that you may want to share?
So limitations on target shooting, it's a very similar topic to wood gathering. They're placing these limitations again without justification. Again, kind of feels like they're just publishing to the public for no reason. They haven't really given examples of where they have issues. I understand it can be an issue, but okay, where are these issues happening? Can we mitigate them? Can we do it in a different way? So again, they limited it in a very similar way to the wood gathering, to where, in each alternative, it just continually increases. We talked about limitations on vegetation treatments. I've actually talked to biologists within the agency about these vegetation treatments. Vegetation treatments, we don't only do those for livestock grazing, we do them for wildlife as well. And that includes removing these pinyon and junipers and placing native vegetation or non-native vegetation depending on the conditions. And we use that to improve wildlife habitat as well. The problem with these vegetation treatments is they are ugly, and they're ugly for about 5 years. And a lot of people who don't understand vegetation treatments see that and they think, oh, they're destroying the forest, or they're doing this commercial wood harvesting, or whatever thoughts they may have. It doesn't look good, and I agree with that. But after 5 years, you start to see the benefits of it. You have the grasses and forbs come in that really do benefit wildlife, and there are major limitations on when and where you can do these, to the point where even the biologists that I've talked to are concerned about, we're going to end up with a stagnant stand of pinyon and juniper throughout the monument, and we're going to lose a lot of diversity by allowing that to happen. The other thing is, right-of-way exclusion areas where we cannot communication towers, we can't run pipelines, we can't run water lines, we can't do transmission lines. A lot of the monument is excluded of that, which we need to improve our infrastructure. Another big thing that we have an issue with is just general impacts to the economy. Each one of these restrictions has an impact to the economy. And, restriction on grazing, restriction on travel, restriction on recreation, they're kind of cutting into each one of these things. And if you combine those together, it's going to have a significant impact to our economy. One thing the listeners might not understand is we have very small schools. Bryce Valley High School has a graduating class of about 20 people. Same thing with Escalante. And if we get really any further below that number, that's where these districts look and see, okay, is it feasible to operate a school in this area with just this few students? And our concern is if we start losing jobs, we might start losing kids in our schools. We shut down a school. That even further reduces the appeal of somebody moving to the town, and our economy continues. It's kind of a snowball effect where our economy really takes a hit. So that's something that we don't want to see, and that's something that Again, the BLM has not analyzed in this plan, and which they have a requirement to do so. We just haven't seen it. Really, one thing we keep hearing is that the BLM is presenting a range of alternatives. Well, in our mind, they're really not. What we're really seeing here is what they call the ratchet effect. Right now, we have status quo, right? And each alternative we're seeing is more and more restrictive. And every time we open up one of these plans, we go from status quo, which may have been more restrictive than the last plan, and it just goes more restrictive from there. And that's one of our frustrations. Is as an example, when President Clinton designated the monument, in his speech, he actually said, I'll quote him, he said, "Let me make a few things in this proclamation clear. First, it only applies to federal lands that belong already to the American people. Second, under the proclamation, families will be able to use this canyon as they always have. The land will remain open for multiple uses, including hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, and grazing." So you can see over the last 20 years, we've been ratcheted down. Each one of these, we're losing a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, to the point where they're proposing 50% of this monument be close to grazing. So it's really frustrating for us that every time one of these plans opens up, it's let's start from where we're at and just go more restrictive. It's never in the opposite direction of, hey, let's open up, let's create new trails, let's create new recreational sites, let's do a new road to this area. It's never that. And we understand that's not always appropriate, but they are not even considering it. And so we're at least trying to fight for what we already have.
Yes, and that is a really helpful perspective to look back at the history and see what you're saying on that. Because I was thinking that it's always good to re-examine plans and see where you're at and see what can be improved upon. But from your perspective, I can see where it feels like it's just getting more restrictive every time that they do this. So that's really interesting. I appreciate so much that you've taken the time to share all of this. And it really is what I love